All right, guys, welcome to part two of chapter 16, Dictatorship and Democracy in Europe during the 1930s. I want to divide this up, like I said, into a couple of different sections to go from Hitler's rise to power into, why he rose to power, and why really there was no resistance against him that was very widespread. And then we're going to kind of go down and talk about the evolution of the Italian fascist state, Mussolini, and look at briefly some other authoritarian governments, the Soviet Union, and some differences between Nazism and Stalinism. But first, let's go back up here, okay? And let's talk about why Hitler. All right. As the guy in notes kind of highlight, he's very popular by 1938. Majority of Germans are completely fine with him, right? And that leads to another question: how can this happen? How is that able to exist in a 20th century world, right? As we look more and more, we'll find out that it isn't necessarily a secret that he's doing some very eyebrow-raising activities relative to Jews. Remember, this is the year of Kristallnacht as well. So, how is this possible? How could this actually happen? And why was there no widespread oppositions? The biggest thing, Germans at this point are kind of done with the old German political leaders. They were the kind of the ones that were in charge of the Weimar Republic. Um, and, it is seen as old and stale, you know, for for the country to keep running on supposed democracy, of which there's not really that big of a tradition. I'm over here on the Wikipedia page for the Weimar Republic. Only 14 years is it in existence, right? So it doesn't work. This democratic experiment really doesn't work. Okay, the peace at Versailles, inflation, defeat in World War One, and the Great Depression. All of these things are leading to a general disillusionment with the Weimar Republic. Okay, it's seen as ineffective, and really the cause of all of the misery that is happening in Germany in the interwar years. Also, another reason why Hitler stays in power: old elites, they can't get any mass support before Hitler rises to power. There's still kind of this leftover hangover, really, of old landed aristocracy. The old landed aristocracy in Germany has no broad appeal to the industrialized and more knowledgeable lower classes, working classes, and growing middle classes. There's still a sense that there's a disconnect. And this is why, honestly, Karl Marx, even though he is from a more affluent society, predicts that a communist revolution will happen inside of Germany because the elites had no ability to actually garner support from the masses. Those who are still interested in government, the elites that are still interested in government, cooperate with Hitler. Remember, they were supposed to or planning on using him as a puppet, and that didn't work out very well. No other group majorly opposes him. You could say, well, if they would have opposed him, they would have been put to the sword, and that's sort of true. He does murder, or at least maybe murder is too strong of a term. He does push out the German left, which was strong, but there's no real major organization that rises to confront him at all during his power. Maybe the only group that even holds a candle is the SA. And remember the Night of the Long Knives, he murders all of them. So anyway, not very effective at moving past. Sorry, the German people are not very effective at mounting any sort of resistance to Hitler. He was very emotional. He had this emotion was tied to nationalism. He's very charismatic. He used propaganda and spectacle. Again, like we see at the Nuremberg rallies, he's very, very effective at making this pageantry, this display of the strength and might of the Nazi system. So then this would draw you in, right? If you're a normal German, you would see this and go, "Holy smokes! Like, this is pretty impressive. I should probably be a part of this spectacle." So he's very, very good at that as well. And ordinary Germans, right, can also see his lower class background and say, "Hey, that's like me, right? I'm not a war hero. I'm not like Hindenburg. I'm not an elite like Bismarck. I'm obviously have nothing in common with like a Kaiser. Hitler's from a lower class background. Okay, he's an artist. He's a foot soldier in World War One. So there's a lot of support that comes from the fact that he is more approachable, at least in terms of where he comes from. And then finally, he uses unemployment. Lowers unemployment, and he defies the Allies, or he defies this, um, I guess he reinterprets the picture of Germany as being the sole cause for World War One, and he kind of pushes back against the Allies. He remilitarizes. He tries to make Germany strong. The Allies kind of go along with it, as we've already mentioned. He does use intimidation. He does use force in order to get rid of any opposition. But once again, we don't want to necessarily say that he is, you know, using these all the time, because there's really not a lot of opposition to begin with, right? If there is opposition, it's small, it's not very well organized, and it's put down relatively easily. Okay. Italy. Let's jump over to Italy real quick. Oh wait, sorry, to finish the resistance. Those who do resist, German Catholic and Protestant churches. Okay, church leaders, including the Pope and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, which I'll show you in a minute, they actually get imprisoned. Dietrich Bonhoeffer is actually put to death at a death camp in 1945, right as being liberated, literally like a day or two before. The Pope is kind of unreachable because he's the Pope, right? He's in the Vatican City, which at this point is a separate state. But those who it's actually interesting. Christians are those who are most vocal against the Nazi system, as they should be, right? I mean, obviously Jesus doesn't preach putting to death people who are not like you. But still, there are many in the church in Germany who don't resist, and they kind of change the Christian ideology, the Christian belief system to kind of fit along Nazism, which is kind of amazing. It's not like Nazis never went to church. Now, Hitler's not like this amazing Christian, but many Nazis in Germany were Christians, and they kind of went along with the system. All right. But overall, like I said, no widespread opposition. Even the violations of the rights of Jews, those are all coming second to a Germany that is stronger, right? And that's recovered, and people are back to work. This is a really cool site to look at. It's the American Holocaust Museum. Little spotlight on Dietrich Bonhoeffer. There he is. He's a pretty intelligent guy. Pretty involved in what we know as a German evangelical church, and really pushing very strongly against the Nazi system. So worth looking at him if you have some spare time. He's a pretty fascinating guy inside of Nazi Germany. Italy. Now we'll get to Italy. All right. Remember, Germany is not the first fascist state. Okay, Italy is. Mussolini is already in power for a decade. And his black shirts have been in power for a decade. Pull a picture of him real quick. That's a pretty cool symbol, actually, for the black shirts. This was one of the pictures I have on your test. There are a bunch of them, though. So he's been consolidating power, and he really is a true fascist in the kind of the literal sense of the term. Remember, they create the name fascism from an Italian word, which means combat group. And he consolidated power. He still has conflicts with the Pope. And in fact, they actually end up signing a treaty known as the Lateran Treaty that gives the Pope control over the Vatican City and gave it its independence. So before that, after it had unified in 1870, after Italy had unified in 1870, all of the Pope's lands, the papal states, went under the new Italian government, and actually even the Vatican is inside of Italy. So the Pope wasn't even ruling his own city. And this changes in 1929. Mussolini is actually able to sign a treaty with the Pope, giving them complete control over the Vatican City, which is interesting because he's actually an atheist. Mussolini is an atheist, but he's allowing the Catholic Church to both educate, and he actually allows marriage laws to remain intact. So he doesn't really change up the Catholic system. He probably knows if he tried to, many Italians would lose support for Mussolini. Okay. Now, the state, though, is still seen as pagan. It's very secularized. Mussolini obviously is not ruling with any sort of Christian message in mind. He forms what is known as a corporate state, and that basically means that employers, employees, and the government, right, sets wages and working hours. It would actually kind of, seem a little bit akin to socialism today, but it's all there to back up big business. All right. Um, which is interesting. Once again, fascism isn't supposed to necessarily be a top-down movement. It's a grassroots movement, but this kind of corporate statehood of Italy, even though it's good for business, it's really good for those who are rich, which are not obviously the initial supporters of the fascist system. 1937, the government takes over all sorts of industries, including shipping, electricity, heavy machinery, steel, and telephones. Other fascist states, just to be aware of, Spain and Portugal are going to be two of those. Francisco Franco is going to be the one that's in charge. He's going to be in charge of Spain. Spain has a big civil war that happens inside of the 1930s. Will be kind of overtaken by Francisco Franco. Antonio Salazar will take over in Portugal. He rules as dictators for 3 decades. These dictators, all right, they rule actually, interestingly, from a Christian perspective, a papal decree that criticizes modern individualism and abuses of capitalism and Marxism. So they are fascist, right-leaning. They stay in power for close to 3 to 4 decades. Eastern Europe, only the Czech Republic doesn't exist. Only Czechoslovakia remains a democracy by 1938. But even the German people that live there, and I'll show you a picture of that real quick, even the German people that live there are already pushing to get out. This is a pretty cool map. Germany, of course, the Reich is right here. Poland is right here. And Czechoslovakia is one of those melting pot countries. Ukrainians all the way in the east, and then your Germanics are kind of over here in the west, areas we can consider the Sudetenland today. So interestingly enough, these Germans are clamoring to be part of the Reich. Okay, and the problem is that there's Czechs also all in this western area. So the Sudetenland will be annexed pretty quickly in 1938-39, and then we'll start to see a full-scale invasion of Czechoslovakia. So the last democracy in the West will fall. That last thing, Soviet Union, they create what is known as a second 5-year plan. Stalin is trying to counter the rise of Japan and Germany. He wants to strengthen industrialization. It builds up heavy industry. And this is where really Stalin will move away from the old revolution. The Bolshevik revolution is betrayed. This idea of transferring power down the ranks to all Russians. He abandons it completely. He's interested here in increasing industrial output, even if it means that Russians will starve. All of Lenin's progressive agenda was more or less abandoned or repealed. Women have less power, including making it harder to have abortions or divorces. Collective farms have wage incentives to increase productivity. High party members, those who are attached to power, industrial leaders will get a privileged life, so there'll be an imbalance in the system, which is certainly not communism. Housing, dirty, cramped, food shortages, lacking of consumer goods. So he's going to look actually to nationalism too. Stalin will look to nationalism to prop up the Russian state. Whereas Marxism doesn't care about what country one is from, and that's why we can say Stalinism really isn't communism. It's a little bit different. He is interested in a strong and mighty Russia, not just a strong and mighty working class that is more or less in charge of the resources of production inside of Russia. They'll start to celebrate their past, which, curiously enough, they'll celebrate their czarist past, which they killed the czar. So it's kind of interesting. A revision of history. They'll come to celebrate all of the old kings and queens of Russia, even though they killed them to create their new state. Finally, Stalin uses the Great Terror to basically get rid of his political opponents inside of the Soviet Union. Okay, this would be kind of like the Night of the Long Knives. This term, by the way, is coined by a guy named Robert Conquest, who wrote this book, A Great Terror, Stalin's Purge of the 30s. Awesome book. Awesome name, by the way, for an author, Robert Conquest. I wish my last name was Conquest. Anyway, really good stuff. And he kind of gives it this term. In the Great Terror, right? Stalin arrests and murders many of his political opponents, including generals and colonels in the military. 70% of the Central Committee party members have been shot by 1939. So, over the 1930s, he's really consolidating power. He's getting more and more paranoid. Even has the guy Nikolai Yezhov, right, who's in charge of the Great Terror, at its most advanced phase, will end up being executed. So, this is a reign of terror inside of Stalin's Russia. 8 million people are going to be sent to labor camps in the late 1920s to the 1930s. So, a lot of times we maybe overemphasize the Holocaust at the expense of other events like the Great Terror, and certainly the Great Terror was a Holocaust in many ways. It may not have killed as many people, and certainly weren't Jews, but this was the same sort of systemic execution of anyone who didn't fit inside of what a political leader thought was the right way to rule a country, right? And if you had never heard of that, well, that shows how really great a job that Holocaust historians have done in telling the story of Jews. But we still have a lot more stories to tell, obviously. Lastly, we want to look at Nazism versus Stalinism. For this, I'll go back to the guided notes here, and this is a pretty good chart. I'll read these off real quick. Similarities: Hitler and Stalin have great power and were dictators, obviously. Very good at using propaganda to emphasize their own superhumanness, their godlike qualities. Have huge control over different social structures, including the government, judiciary, police, economy, education, the press, using terror and fear, responsible for millions of deaths. So their similarities are really basically that they're authoritarians, they kill a lot of people, right? And that they use media and propaganda very effectively to do this. Differences, right? Communists preach class warfare, right? That deals harshly with the upper and the middle class. Of course, Stalin doesn't end up really adhering to this. He creates an upper class based on those who have access to governmental power and resources. Hitler will also benefit from his position with the upper class, but he is completely comfortable with a class system. He doesn't like capitalism necessarily in the beginning, but he comes to more or less espouse the idea that there will be different classes, and that's maybe a natural order for mankind. Hitler is more aggressively nationalistic than Stalin, right? Stalin isn't creating a pan-Slavic state at any point in time, whereas Hitler is creating a pan-Germanic state for sure. And lastly, Stalin did not emphasize racism, right? So he certainly emphasizes making sure that peasants are working hard for the communal farms or they're starved, but he's not necessarily picking out all of the Bulgarians that live in Russia and putting them to death, or all the Mongolians. So racism is not anywhere near as emphasized, although Stalin actually is quite anti-Semitic, or Russia has plenty of anti-Semitic moments in the 1920s or 30s. Anyway, that's it for chapter 16. Let me know if you have any questions. Send me an email, and good luck on your questions. Thanks.